हेलो स्टूडेंट्स, आज मैं आपके सामने रोमांटिसिज्म के बारे में, रोमांटिक रिवाइवलिज्म के बारे में बात करूंगा। आज मैं रेस्टोरेशन एज की बैकग्राउंड में रोमांटिसिज्म के कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स के बारे में आई विल टॉक अबाउट द चीफ कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ रोमांटिक एज अगेंस्ट द बैकग्राउंड ऑफ द रेस्टोरेशन पोइट्री। रेस्टोरेशन एज में कुछ सेट रूल्स को फॉलो किया जाता था। सम सेट रूल्स वर फॉलोड इन द रेस्टोरेशन पोइट्री। और वो सेट रूल्स क्या क्या थे? वो सेट रूल्स क्लासिकल राइटर्स ने जो ग्रीक एरा में जो नियम बनाए, द रूल्स सेट बाय द क्लासिकल राइटर्स वर फॉलोड बाय द पोइट्स एंड राइटर्स of the Restoration period. But the poets of the Romantic age deviated or completely broke away from those rules. उन रूल्स को रोमांटिक एरा के राइटर्स ने बिल्कुल भी फॉलो नहीं किया। दूसरी ख़ास बात जो रेस्टोरेशन एज की पोइट्री की थी वो ये थी कि उस एज में, उस ज़माने में सिटी लाइफ पर, कोर्ट लाइफ पर, कॉफ़ी हाउसेस, थिएटर्स, these places were the settings of poetry was being written against the background of coffee houses and theaters and court life and these things. Whereas in the Romantic age we see hills and dales and jungles and forests and streams and for the farms, these things, brooks, springs, etc. ये बैकग्राउंड हमें इस पोइट्री में देखने को मिलती है। तो ये रोमांटिक एज की पोइट्री की बैकग्राउंड की बात हुई। रोमांटिक एज वर्ड्सवर्थ की प्रीफेस टू लिरिकल बैलेड्स के साथ हम शुरुआत मान सकते हैं। और ये सिलसिला लंबा चलता रहा। रोमांटिक एज की जो पोइट्री है वो एस्केपिज्म की पोइट्री है। द पोइट्री ऑफ रोमांटिक एज इज द पोइट्री ऑफ एस्केपिज्म। द पोइट्स ऑफ दिस एरा try to escape from the realities of their humdrum life, of the daily lives. और इस की वजह से उन्होंने सिटी लाइफ पर नहीं लिखा। इसी वजह से उन्होंने रोज़मर्रा की ज़िंदगी की बोरियत या क्रूअल्टी या कट थ्रोट कंपटीशन के बारे में नहीं लिखा। और उन्होंने लिखा और उन्होंने लिखा जंगलों के बारे में, वो सेटिंग लेकर के, पहाड़ों की सेटिंग लेकर के, ब्रूक्स एंड हिल्स एंड डेल्स एंड फ्लावर्स एंड फार्म्स। और उन्होंने नहीं लिखा कॉफ़ी हाउसेस के बारे में, थिएटर्स की बैकग्राउंड के अगेंस्ट में। और वो लिखते रहे कंटिन्यूसली एंड दिस पोइट्री बिकेम वेरी पॉपुलर। सेकेंडली, द रोमांटिक पोइट्स यूज्ड द लैंग्वेज ऑफ द कॉमन मैन। और वो ये मानते थे कि कॉमन मैन की लैंग्वेज को हम यूज़ करेंगे तो ही पोइट्री में वो इंटेंसिटी, वो फीलिंग, वो इमोशंस आएंगे जो कि पोइट्री को बेसिकली डिफाइन करते हैं. So we can say the poetry of the Romantic revival is in direct contrast to that of Neo-classical age. In the 18th century, poetry was governed by set rules laid down by the classical writers. There were well prepared lines of poetic composition, and any deviation from the rules was disliked by the critics and even by the readers. The first thing that we notice in the poetry of Romantic age is that they broke from the slavery of the rules and regulations. The poets of the Romantic age wrote poetry in freestyle without following any rules and regulations. So they preferred blank verse, like in Prelude we see blank verse, and they wrote in iambic pentameter, which is very close to the intonation or the style of the common man. The poetry of the 18th century was concerned with clubs and coffee houses and theatres, drawing rooms, and the social and political life of London. It was essentially the poetry of town life. In Romantic era, we see nature had practically no place in the poems. Now in the poetry of Romantic revival, the interest of poets was transferred from the town to the rural life and from artificial decorations of the drawing rooms to the natural beauty and the loveliness of nature. Nature began to have its own importance in the poetry of this age. Wordsworth was the greatest poet who revealed the physical and spiritual beauty of nature to those who were blind to any charm in the wildflowers, in the green fields, in the chirping birds, in the flowing streams, rivers, hills, dales. Wordsworth saw some unseen spirit emanating from the natural phenomena. Romantic poets started taking interest in the lives of the common people, the shepherds and the cottagers, and left the gallant lords and gay butterflies of the fashion to the care of the novelists. We see in Solitary Reaper by Wordsworth, he takes interest in a lone solitary reaper in a field. A renowned interest in simple life marked by poetry of the Romantic age, a feeling of humanitarianism colored the poetry of Wordsworth, of Shelley, of Byron. The Romantic poetry was marked by a keen interest in human sympathy and a consequent understanding of the human heart. Earlier we see poets in the Restoration era did not explore the human heart, did not take any interest in the common man. Another thing we notice in the poetry of Romantic era is the keen interest in liberty and democracy. The emphasis now was laid on liberty and freedom of the individual. Romantic poets were rebels against tyranny and brutality exercised by tyrants and despots over human beings who were already suffering under poverty and other physical limitations. One more thing that we notice in the poetry of the Romantic age is that, as I mentioned you, they were escapists. They escaped into the imaginative world. They escaped in the medieval ages also. They took interest in the medieval life. They did not like tyranny and misery and ugliness of materialistic life, but in order to avoid the life of the realities, they escaped from the problems of the world to a world of beauty and joy. They took interest in imaginative world of imagery, imagination, beauty, love, medieval life, castles, etc. This poetry proved to be the poetry of escape from the sorrows and sufferings of the worldly life, and their times to the Middle Ages, where they found the eternal bliss. The enthusiasm for the Middle Ages intensified the emotional sense of wonder on the one hand, and the intellectual sense of curiosity on the other hand. As we see, Coleridge, especially, was very much fascinated to the medieval themes, medieval setting. We see in the ancient mariner, Christabel, the setting is medieval. There are supernatural elements, ghosts, witches, suspense, everything. We see predominance of imagination and emotions in the Romantic poetry. In the Romantic poetry, reason and intellect were subdued, and their place was taken by imagination, emotions, and passion, intense passion. In the poetry of all the Romantic poets, we find heightened emotional sensibilities and imaginative flights of genius, bordering on heavenly, you say, abodes. This was never done by the poets of the previous age. So their flights were uncensored by rationale. And the poets of the previous age could never imagine that their successors will start writing poetry in this manner. we see one more thing, and the poetry of this period, in the poetry of Romantic age, and this is supernaturalism. Coleridge was especially attracted to this phenomenon. Supernaturalism is another outstanding quality of the Romantic poetry. Poets like Coleridge and Scott gave a sense of wonder and mystery to poetry. It was this supernaturalism that gave the atmosphere of wonder and mystery to the Romantic poetry. As we see, as I have already mentioned, in the rhyme of Ancient Mariner, we are spellbound by a sense of wonder and mystery throughout the poem. And the reader thinks, oh, what is going to happen to the mariners? What are they going to do now? So in this sense we say that there is, endless variety in the poetry of this age. In Romantic poetry, we come across an endless variety. The poetry of this age is as varied as the characters and moods of different writers. And the most important thing of the poetry of this age is the subjectivity. Most of them write in first person, like Shelley, like Keats. Subjectivity began to have its full play in the poetry of this age. The poets of this period were in favor of giving a subjective interpretation to the objective realities of life. So we see that the poetry of this period is an expression of individual genius rather than the established rules. As we see in the previous era, they followed rules and they believed that to follow the classical writers is to follow nature. In Romantic poetry, lyricism predominates, and the poets of this school have to their credit a number of fine lyrics excelling the heroic couplet of the Neoclassical age in melody and sweetness of tone. The poetry of this period is melodious, is sweet. There is variety. They wrote odes, they wrote sonnets, ballads, and whatnot. The style of the Romantic poets is varied, but the stress was laid on simplicity. Instead of an artificial model of the expression of classical poets, we have a natural diction and spontaneousness way of expressing thoughts in Romantic poetry. And that is the reason why the poetry of this age is varied in tone, because the themes of this period have been taken from simple life.